Thank you very much, both of you. Good job. Okay, we'll open up for questions. Do we have any questions? Yep. Neil?
Thanks, Bill. Neil Conklin, Farm Foundation. I have a question for John. You talked about quantities, but you didn't get to what prices were implied by your analysis of supply and demand through 2050. Could you give us a little flavor for what the price path looks like?
As we looked at our forecast, of course, it's a partial equilibrium that uses prices to equate supply and demand worldwide. And so when we forecast to 2050, what we see in prices for corn and for oil seeds is an acceleration in prices in the last 10 to 15 years. It's not a dramatic, it's about 10% in nominal prices. So in real terms, you're probably still slightly falling, although picking up maybe in those last few years. The price levels that you see are about, in general, about 10% weaker than what you would have seen, somewhere around a 380 corn price, somewhere in the vicinity of a 550 wheat price, soybeans in that 950 range.
Yes.
Hi. Ann Tutwiler, USDA. Keith, first of all, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. I'd seen some of that, but appreciate it. I wanted to ask you a question, though. Have you all gotten a sense of the time lag between the investments, the kinds of investments that are needed to increase the total factor productivity? Because that's something I think we're going to be struggling with as we move forward on the food security initiative, is what kind of time frame are we looking at for some of these investments?
Yeah, thanks, Ann. No, that's a very good question, and I think there are different parts to the answer. There are some things that we find that can increase TFP growth in the short run, but their effect is rather limited in terms of, and here I'm talking primarily about improving market structure, market liberalization, and also creating rural peace and rural stability that allows basically creating an environment whereas farmers can produce and have the incentives to produce and the ability to produce for the market. We've seen countries that once they have restored, that have gone through long periods of civil strife, once they've restored rural stability, that they've been able to increase TFP growth, but kind of getting back basically to previous levels. But we do get this spurt of growth when we do see effects of these kinds of policies. But then those, once they're kind of made those resource adjustments, then that source of growth doesn't sustain. And in order to get a long sustained growth, that's when you really have to have the research and technology capacity that will deliver a continuous stream of improvements to farmers to continually raise their productivity growth. And there we're looking at longer-term legs. I think, if we're thinking, for example, and there has been quite a bit of work to try to look at what the patterns of those leg effects are of today's investments in research. When can we expect they will start affecting measured TFP at the farm level? And we're looking at a minimum of really 5 years, and getting maximum effects maybe 10 or 15 years. But then those effects of today's investments extend out decades into the future. Because if you think about developing a new variety, that will raise productivity, but it tends to do so in a long period of time, because initially farmers will adopt a new variety, they'll without changing much else in their farming system. But then later on, they'll learn and adopt other kinds of management practices to continue to get improved, to get sort of the maximum benefits out of those new technologies. But the key, I think, is thinking about, capacity of establishing capacity in these countries that will allow them to develop a whole stream of improvements that will be able to sustain that kind of growth over a long period.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
Emmy Simmons, a partnership to cut hunger and poverty in Africa. I too enjoyed the presentation, but wondered about sort of the lesson that came particularly out of that one very striking graph of historical progression in terms of contributions to total factor productivity, and the extremely striking sort of shrinkage of the labor share. And I'm wondering, in sort of light of past is prologue, whether that sort of trend line in your mind translates into a roadmap for development, because we've been hearing about this morning about food insecurity and related to unemployment, and the fact that many developing countries really feel they need to create employment in agriculture, higher return employment, true. But could you just kind of consider how that trend line plays out in the future and the point at which it translates into a development strategy?
I think the experience with the Green Revolution can be quite illustrative here, in that depending upon the nature of technical change, it can be a real employment booster. And the history of the Green Revolution is that it was what we call labor-using technology, in that it did dramatically increase employment in agriculture, and you might say kept people in agriculture much longer than they would have been without the Green Revolution. They would have left agriculture in order to make a livelihood elsewhere. And you can look at different countries have followed different paths in their development depending upon sort of their resource endowments. If you look at the history of American agriculture, where you had a lot of land relative to labor, the path of technological change here was much more in developing labor substitutes, more mechanized agriculture. But then you compare it to a place like Japan, where you had much more labor and very little arable land. The path to development there was really to intensify the use of that land, and as a result, for much longer in their development path, there was much larger shares of labor in agriculture. And so on the global scale, we see in countries, OECD countries are certainly losing labor. Some of the more middle-income countries are also they're going now toward a more, because of higher wages and more opportunities offered in the industrialized or manufacturing or service sectors. They're leaving agriculture. But then that actually raises the resources available to workers remaining in agriculture. But in the very poor countries, I think we can anticipate, particularly, again, I think your point is well taken, that these countries really need to generate more employment, more gainful employment in their agricultural sectors for the next several decades. And the kind of technological path that would facilitate that would be one that really tries to intensify the existing use of land, the kind of we call biological innovations of the kind that the Green Revolution exemplified.
We had any other questions? We'll have one more, and then we better move on.
Dean Kleckner, Truth About Trade and Technology. Has there been any research, for either one of you, has there been any research done on the competition between private sector research and public sector research, how one affects the other? Lack of one, does that mean the other is more proactive? Or if one is proactive, the other one isn't or doesn't have to be? Most farmers, I'm a farmer, most farmers say we need more public sector research. We're not willing to put money in to do it, but we just think it ought to be done, obviously. So in reaction to that, the private sector then does more, patents it, and that's part of the problem of the competition that's out there now, public, it seems to me, public versus private sector. Question, what research has been done between the competition, if any, between public and private sector?
You know, I think I can at least partly address that question. I've been involved in a couple of studies that have looked at that question, both in developing countries and here in the United States. And working with Carl Prey up at Rutgers University, we did a study, looked at the growth of the private sector R&D, private sector agricultural research in about 7 Asian countries. And what were the factors that led to more private R&D or less in those countries? And one of the factors was that the private sector seemed to be more willing to put money, their own resources, into research in countries that had a good public sector research system. So they were seen as complementary in that, because then those were resources that the private sector could draw upon, both in terms of technologies that they could work into to commercialize, but also in terms of human capital, people that they could employ for their own research stations and laboratories. And so there was a real complementarity there in terms of where the private sector was willing to invest resources. Now, when you come to a country like the United States, where you have much more sophisticated research going on in both the public and private sectors, it's more complicated. But in a study we did a few years ago, we looked at plant breeding, for example, and looking at how, where there's been a lot of growth in private investment in crop technology, and how that was affected by both the private or public investment in those areas, and then also how the public sector seemed to respond to that development. And again, what we found in that research was there strong complementarities in that where private sector, because of stronger intellectual property and other factors, put more money into commodity research, the public sector's response was to reduce its investment in the more applied research and shift its resources into more sort of basic breeding and basic germplasm enhancement. Whereas, and so that there was, the system seemed to promote this complementarity between the sectors to improve the overall efficiency of the agricultural innovation system, at least in this particular example.
Thank you, Keith. You give them all a good hand.